Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Ghost Returns. Greg Hull adjusted his black tie in the rearview mirror of his rental car, staring at the weathered face that looked back at him. For years of sleeping in shelters, eating at soup kitchens, and working odd jobs had carved deep lines around his steel-gray eyes. But beneath the surface of apparent defeat, something darker burned, a patience that had been forged in the crucible of absolute loss. The funeral home parking lot was packed with expensive cars, a stark reminder of the wealth he'd once known. Greg had grown up in the Hull family mansion, heir to a construction empire built by 3 generations of Hull men. His father, Harold Hull, had been a titan in the industry, owning everything from concrete plants to luxury resort developments across 3 states. Greg had worked alongside him since he was 16, learning every aspect of the business, earning his place as the natural successor. That was before his brother Chad had poisoned everything. Chad Hull had always been the charming one, quick with a smile, faster with a lie. While Greg buried himself in blueprints and construction schedules, Chad had focused on networking and politics. He'd married early to a senator's daughter, giving him connections Greg never thought to cultivate. When their mother died 10 years ago, Chad had started working on their father, planting seeds of doubt about Greg's instability and drinking problem, lies that grew into accepted truth through constant repetition. But the killing blow had come from the woman Greg had loved more than life itself. Lynette Hendricks had been Greg's college sweetheart, a psychology major with honey blonde hair and a laugh that could light up a room. They'd been together for 8 years, married for 5, and Greg had never doubted her loyalty. She knew about the family tensions, had even defended Greg against Chad's subtle manipulations. Or so he'd thought. The day Greg discovered the truth still burned in his memory like acid. He'd come home early from a job site, wanting to surprise Lynette for their anniversary. Instead, he'd found her in their bed with Chad, moving together with the familiarity of longtime lovers. The confrontation that followed had been volcanic. Accusations, admissions, and the revelation that they'd been together for 2 years. "I never loved you," Lynette had said, her voice cold as winter steel. "You were just a placeholder until Chad was ready to leave his wife. You're weak, Greg. You always have been. Chad knows how to take what he wants." The divorce had been swift and brutal, with Chad's legal connections and Lynette's accusations of domestic violence. Lies, but convincing ones. Greg had lost everything. The family business went to Chad as Harold chose his stable son over his violent one. The house, the cars, the investments, all gone. Within 6 months, Greg Hull had been transformed from millionaire heir to homeless vagrant. Now, standing outside the funeral home where his father's body lay in state, Greg felt no grief, only the cold satisfaction of knowing his time for justice had finally arrived. He walked through the parking lot, noting the familiar faces through expensive car windows. Local politicians, business partners, society wives, all the people who had turned their backs on him when his fall from grace became public knowledge. They would all be inside, paying their respects to Harold Hull while carefully avoiding eye contact with his disgraced son. The funeral home's lobby was exactly as Greg remembered from his mother's service. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the cloying scent of too many flowers. He signed the guest book with steady hands, aware of the whispers that followed his movement through the crowd. "Is that really Greg Hull? I heard he's been living on the streets. Such a shame what happened to that family." Greg found his father's casket surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements, most bearing cards from Chad's business associates. Harold Hull looked smaller in death, his weathered hands folded over his chest. Greg felt nothing as he stared down at the man who had chosen Chad's lies over his own son's truth. Well, look what the cat dragged in." Greg turned to see Chad approaching, looking every inch the successful businessman in his $1,000 suit. At 38, Chad had maintained his college quarterback physique, though his face had gained the soft smugness that came with unearned success. Behind him walked Lynette, now carrying the Hull name she'd schemed to claim. She'd barely changed, still beautiful, still cold, still wearing that calculating look Greg now recognized as her true nature. "Hello, Chad." "Lynette." Greg's voice was steady, betraying none of the rage that simmered beneath the surface. Chad's grin was all teeth and malice. "Still homeless and divorced?" "LMAO." He actually said the acronym out loud, as if Greg's suffering was nothing more than an internet joke. Lynette stepped closer, her perfume a cloying reminder of their shared past. "Hey, useless child," she said, using the pet name she'd once claimed was affectionate. "Still the same pathetic loser, I see." The crowd around them had gone quiet, sensing drama. Greg could feel dozens of eyes watching, waiting for him to break, to give them the spectacle they'd come to expect from the fallen Hull brother. Instead, Greg smiled. Before he could respond, a distinguished voice cut through the tension. "Perfect timing. I have something important to tell you." Matthew Jackson, the Hull family lawyer for 30 years, had appeared beside them with a manila envelope in his weathered hands. The elderly attorney's face was grave as he looked between the three of them. "Perhaps we should step into the private viewing room," Jackson continued. "What I have to say concerns the reading of Harold's will, and I believe it requires immediate attention." Greg watched Chad's face shift from smugness to confusion, while Lynette's eyes narrowed with the sharp calculation he remembered so well. They thought they knew what was coming. Another humiliation for Greg, another victory for their twisted partnership. They had no idea that Greg Hull had spent 4 years planning for this exact moment. Chapter 2. The Foundation of Betrayal. 5 years earlier, Greg Hull had been living what most people would consider a perfect life. As vice president of Hull Construction, he managed a company worth over $50 million, overseeing projects from luxury condominiums to government infrastructure contracts. His marriage to Lynette seemed solid, built on 8 years of shared history and mutual ambition. They lived in a sprawling estate in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, hosted dinner parties for business associates, and talked about starting a family. Greg had been naive enough to believe it was real. The first crack in his perfect world had come during a family dinner at the Hull mansion. Chad had been discussing his divorce from Senator Morrison's daughter, Patricia, claiming irreconcilable differences. Greg had offered his support, even suggesting Chad move into their guest house until he found his own place. "That's generous of you, brother," Chad had said with what Greg now recognized as calculated sincerity. "But I think I need to be completely independent. Fresh start and all that." Harold had nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking, son. A man needs to stand on his own 2 feet. Greg had noticed how his father used son when addressing Chad, while he himself rarely received more than a grunt of acknowledgement. It had stung, but Greg had attributed it to Chad's recent emotional trauma. That same evening, Lynette had been unusually quiet during the drive home. When Greg asked if something was wrong, she'd turned to him with an expression he'd never seen before, something calculating and cold. "Do you ever wonder if you're living the right life?" she'd asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you sure you're with the right person? In the right family position? Sometimes I think people settle for what's comfortable instead of fighting for what they really want." Greg had laughed, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "I've got everything I want right here." But Lynette had pulled her hand away, staring out the window with that distant look that would become increasingly familiar over the following months. The betrayal had been methodical and thorough. While Greg focused on running the day-to-day operations of Hull Construction, Chad worked on their father's perception of reality. Family dinners became opportunities for Chad to subtly undermine Greg's decisions, questioning his judgment on projects and highlighting every minor setback as evidence of deeper problems. "I'm worried about Greg, Dad," Chad would say with feigned concern. "He's been making some questionable calls lately." The Morrison project was 3 weeks behind schedule because of his miscalculations. It was weather delays, Greg would protest, but Harold's trust had already begun to erode. Meanwhile, Lynette had become increasingly distant, claiming work stress and scheduling conflicts that kept her away from home. Greg had been concerned enough to suggest marriage counseling, but she dismissed the idea with a laugh. "Not everything needs to be fixed, Greg. Sometimes people just grow apart." The lies had been everywhere, but Greg had been too trusting to see them. Chad would show up at their house when Greg was at work, ostensibly to borrow tools or check on Lynette after Greg mentioned she'd been feeling unwell. Lynette would return from girls' nights, smelling like cologne that wasn't Greg's, with explanations that made perfect sense individually, but formed a disturbing pattern when examined together. The business had suffered as Greg became increasingly distracted by his crumbling personal life. A missed deadline here, a cost overrun there. Nothing catastrophic, but enough for Chad to build a case that Greg was becoming unreliable. Harold had started calling Chad directly about projects, bypassing Greg entirely. "I think you need a vacation," Harold had said during what would be their last private conversation. "Chad can handle things for a few weeks while you get your head on straight." Greg had protested, but Harold's mind was made up. The old man's eyes held a disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. The final revelation had come on a Tuesday afternoon in spring. Greg had left work early, driving home with flowers and champagne to surprise Lynette for their 5th wedding anniversary. The house had been quiet when he'd entered, but he'd heard sounds from upstairs, soft voices and movement from their bedroom. The door had been partially open, giving him a perfect view of his wife and brother moving together with practiced intimacy. They weren't just having sex. They were making love with the familiarity of a long-established couple. Watching them, Greg had realized this wasn't a recent affair. It was a relationship that had been growing for months, possibly years. The confrontation had been brutal. Chad had been arrogant, claiming he'd won the better woman, while Lynette had been viciously honest about her true feelings. "You were always the placeholder," she'd said, pulling on Chad's shirt with casual intimacy. "The safe choice while I figured out what I really wanted. Chad has ambition, connections, vision. You're just a worker bee who inherited a crown you never deserved." The divorce proceedings had been swift and merciless. Chad's political connections had provided Lynette with a lawyer who specialized in high-stakes family court cases. Her claims of emotional and physical abuse, all lies, but convincingly delivered, had swayed a judge who seemed predisposed to believe the beautiful victim over the angry husband. Harold had refused to support Greg publicly, claiming he didn't want to take sides in family matters. But privately, he made his choice clear by promoting Chad to president of Hull Construction and removing Greg from all decision-making authority. "You're not thinking clearly," Harold had said during their final argument. "A man who can't control his own household can't be trusted to run a business." Within 6 months, Greg had lost everything: his wife, his family business, his home, and his father's respect. Chad and Lynette had married in a lavish ceremony at the country club where Greg had once been a member. The guest list had included everyone from Greg's former life, all celebrating the triumph of the golden couple over the fallen prince. But what they didn't know was that Greg Hull had inherited more than just a construction company from 3 generations of Hull men. He'd inherited their patience, their ability to plan, and their absolute ruthlessness when dealing with enemies. Over the past 4 years, while living in shelters and working menial jobs, Greg had been planning something that would make his brother and ex-wife understand the true meaning of loss. Chapter 3: The Reading of Vengeance. The private viewing room felt like a courtroom as Matthew Jackson arranged his papers on the mahogany table. Chad sat with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, while Lynette maintained the composed mask she perfected over 4 years of high society marriage. Greg remained standing by the window, appearing calm despite the hurricane of anticipation building in his chest. "Before we begin," Jackson said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I should note that Harold made several significant changes to his will in the weeks before his death. These modifications were made with full legal capacity and proper witnesses." Chad leaned forward. "What kind of changes, Matthew?" "Nothing too dramatic, I hope." The lawyer's expression remained neutral. "I'll read the relevant sections verbatim, as Harold requested." He opened the official document, cleared his throat, and began. "To my son Chad Hull, who has spent the past 4 years believing himself to be my heir and successor, I leave the sum of $100,000 and my collection of fishing equipment. This bequest comes with my recognition of his success in deceiving an old man who should have been wiser." Chad's face went white. "What the hell does that mean?" Jackson continued reading. "To Lynette Hull, nay Hendricks, who married into my family through lies and manipulation, I leave nothing. She has already taken more than her share. Lynette shot to her feet. This is impossible. Harold loved me like a daughter. I was the only one who visited him regularly in his final months. Please sit down, Mrs. Hull, Jackson said firmly. There's more. Greg felt his pulse quicken as the lawyer turned to the next page. To my son, Greg Hull, who I wronged through my own blindness and pride, I leave my sincere apology and the entirety of my estate, including all business holdings, properties, and investments, valued at approximately $68 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Chad's mouth moved soundlessly while Lynette gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white. Furthermore, Jackson continued, I direct my executor to inform Greg that the safety deposit box at First National Bank contains materials that will be of great interest to him. The contents were compiled with the assistance of private investigator Raphael Owen, whom I hired after discovering certain discrepancies in information I had been given about my sons. Chad finally found his voice. This is insane. The old man was clearly suffering from dementia. We'll contest this will so fast, it'll make your head spin. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Jackson replied calmly. Harold underwent comprehensive psychological evaluation just 2 weeks before his death. Dr. Amanda Chung declared him to be of completely sound mind and judgment. Her report is part of the official file. Greg spoke for the first time since entering the room. Tell them about the investigation, Matthew. The lawyer nodded grimly. Harold hired Raphael Owen 18 months ago after becoming suspicious about certain claims made regarding Greg's character and behavior. Owen's report makes for fascinating reading. He pulled out a thick folder and opened it to the first page. For instance, the domestic violence claims made during the divorce proceedings were thoroughly debunked. Owen interviewed 3 witnesses who were present during the alleged incidents. All confirmed they never occurred. Lynette's face had gone pale. You can't prove anything. Those were sealed court records. Owen is very thorough, Jackson continued. He also documented the affair between Chad and Lynette, which began approximately 18 months before Greg discovered it. Hotel records, credit card statements, witness testimonies, quite comprehensive. Chad stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So what? We're all adults here. People fall in love. True, Greg said, finally turning from the window. But corporate fraud is a different matter entirely. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Chad's swagger cracked slightly. What fraud? I've never. Sit down, Chad. Greg's voice carried an authority that made his brother comply instinctively. Let Matthew finish reading. Jackson turned to another section of the report. Owen discovered that Chad had been systematically overbilling clients and skimming profits for nearly 3 years. The money was hidden in offshore accounts established under false names. The total amount appears to be just over $4 million. That's impossible, Chad protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence includes bank records, forged invoices, and testimony from 3 employees who were aware of the scheme but afraid to come forward, Jackson continued. One of them, Stuart Gleason from the accounting department, kept detailed records as insurance against being blamed himself. Lynette was staring at Chad with growing horror. You told me that money came from successful investments. It did come from investments, Chad said desperately. I invested in the company's future by stealing from it, Greg interrupted. By betraying everything our grandfather and father built. By proving that you're exactly the parasite I always suspected you were. Chad lunged toward Greg, but stopped when the door opened to admit 2 men in suits. Gentlemen, Jackson announced, meet Detectives Wayne Farley and Aaron Stevens from the Financial Crimes Division. They've been very interested in Mr. Owen's findings. Detective Farley stepped forward with handcuffs visible on his belt. Chad Hull, you're under arrest for embezzlement, corporate fraud, and tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda warning continued, Chad's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally, desperate terror. Lynette backed against the wall, her perfectly composed mask finally cracking to reveal the calculating opportunist beneath. This isn't over, Chad snarled as the handcuffs clicked shut. I'll fight this. I'll prove you set me up. Greg smiled for the first time in 4 years, a cold, predatory expression that made everyone in the room take a step back. Oh, brother, he said softly. We're just getting started. As the detectives led Chad away, Lynette turned to Greg with something approaching her old seductive smile. Greg, honey, you have to understand, I was trapped. Chad threatened me, controlled me. I never wanted to hurt you. Greg looked at her for a long moment, remembering the woman he'd once loved enough to forgive anything. Then he thought about 4 years of sleeping in shelters while she lived in luxury, built on stolen money and lies. Lynette, he said gently, in about 30 minutes, you're going to receive a visit from the IRS. Turns out when you file joint tax returns with someone who's hiding millions in offshore accounts, you become liable for the unpaid taxes. The penalties and interest should wipe out whatever assets you might have claimed in the divorce. Her mask finally shattered completely. You bastard. You planned this whole thing. I planned nothing, Greg replied. I simply waited for the truth to surface, then made sure it reached the right people. Justice isn't revenge, Lynette. It's just accounting. As she stormed out, Greg turned back to Matthew Jackson, who was organizing his papers with the satisfaction of a job well done. There's one more thing, Greg, the lawyer said. Your father left you a personal letter. He wanted you to read it alone. Greg took the sealed envelope with hands that barely trembled. After 4 years of careful planning and patient waiting, Harold Hull would finally have the last word. Chapter 4. The Letter and the Plan. Greg waited until he was completely alone in his hotel room before opening his father's letter. The envelope bore Harold's distinctive handwriting, still strong despite his 73 years. Inside, 3 pages of thick stationery carried words that Greg had waited 4 years to hear. My son Greg, if you're reading this, then justice has finally been served, though far too late for my liking. I have no excuse for the blindness that allowed me to believe Chad's lies and doubt your character. A man my age should have been wiser, but perhaps the heart always wants to believe the more pleasant lie over the harder truth. Raphael Owen's investigation opened my eyes to the depth of Chad's deception and your innocence in all matters. The domestic violence claims were fabricated, the business failures were sabotaged, and your supposed drinking problem was a complete fiction. I failed you as a father by choosing to believe the son who told me what I wanted to hear over the son who showed me who he really was through his actions. But this letter is not just an apology, it's a roadmap. Owen's investigation uncovered far more than just Chad's corporate theft. I've spent the last 18 months documenting every lie, every manipulation, every crime committed against you and our family legacy. The safety deposit box contains evidence of additional schemes that go far beyond simple embezzlement. Chad has been using Hull Construction as a front for money laundering operations tied to his political connections. The Riverside Casino project was funded with dirty money from Pablo Pollard's organization, filtered through shell companies Chad established. The city contracts were secured through bribes paid to Councilman Terry McKee and Planning Commissioner Hugh Higgins. The entire operation is documented in the files. But Greg, I'm not asking you to simply turn this evidence over to authorities. I'm giving you the tools to destroy them completely, legally, financially, and socially. They took 4 years of your life through lies and manipulation. Take everything from them in return. Your loving father, Harold Hull. P.S. Felix William at the bank has been expecting you. The second safety deposit box contains something else you'll need. Greg set the letter down and walked to the hotel window, staring out at the city where he'd once been a prince and then a pauper. His father's words had lifted a weight he'd carried for 4 years, but they'd also confirmed something he'd suspected. Chad's crimes went far beyond simple theft. The next morning, Greg visited First National Bank. Felix William, a veteran banker with silver hair and knowing eyes, led him to the safety deposit boxes without small talk. The first box contained Raphael Owen's complete investigation files, hundreds of pages of evidence, photographs, financial records, and witness statements. The second box contained something that made Greg smile with genuine appreciation for his father's thorough planning. Cash. Nearly $2 million in untraceable bills, accumulated over 18 months from Harold's personal accounts. Attached was a note for expenses not covered by traditional legal channels. Greg spent the next week studying every document, understanding the full scope of Chad and Lynette's betrayal. The evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into city government, state politics, and organized crime. Chad hadn't just stolen from the family business. He turned it into a criminal enterprise. More importantly, Greg now understood why Lynette had targeted him so specifically. Her psychology degree hadn't been wasted. She'd been the perfect manipulator to identify his weaknesses and exploit them. The entire affair had been calculated from the beginning, designed to position Chad as the reliable heir while discrediting Greg completely. But Harold's investigation had revealed Lynette's true background as well. Her real name was Linda Henderson, and she'd been married twice before under different identities. Each marriage had ended with her husband losing substantial assets through suspicious circumstances. She was a professional predator who'd found the perfect mark in the whole family fortune. On the seventh day, Greg made his first move. He called Detective Wayne Farley and arranged a meeting at a discreet coffee shop downtown. Farley arrived looking skeptical until Greg began laying out documents that expanded the embezzlement case into something much larger. "Jesus Christ," Farley muttered, studying photographs of Chad meeting with known associates of Pablo Pollard. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 3 years," Greg replied. "Probably longer. Hull Construction has been washing money for multiple criminal organizations while also paying bribes for preferential city contracts. The Riverside Casino project alone involved $12 million in dirty money." Farley was a 20-year veteran who'd seen every kind of corruption, but this evidence was overwhelming in its scope and precision. "Why come to me?" he asked finally. "With evidence like this, you could go to the FBI, the state attorney general, anywhere." Greg leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a slight smile. "Because you arrested Chad based on my father's evidence. You've already committed to seeing this through. And because I want them to understand exactly how much they've lost before the federal agencies get involved." Over the next 2 weeks, Greg orchestrated a campaign of revelation that unfolded like a carefully planned military operation. Anonymous tips led reporters to offshore banking records. Suspicious activity reports triggered IRS investigations into multiple shell companies. Witness statements from former employees suddenly became public knowledge. Chad's arrest for embezzlement had been shocking enough. But as the web of corruption unraveled, it became clear that Hull Construction had been the center of a criminal conspiracy that touched dozens of public officials and business leaders. Lynette's true identity as Linda Henderson became front-page news when her previous marriage victims came forward with their stories. The beautiful widow who charmed high society was revealed as a serial predator who destroyed multiple families for financial gain. But Greg's masterstroke came when he arranged for Pablo Pollard to learn that Chad had been cooperating with police from the moment of his arrest. It wasn't true. Chad had maintained his innocence throughout, but Pollard didn't know that. The crime boss's organization had a reputation for handling informants with extreme prejudice. Greg made sure Chad learned about Pollard's displeasure while he was still in county jail awaiting federal charges. The fear in his brother's eyes during their first and only jail visit was worth 4 years of patient waiting. "You set me up," Chad whispered through the bulletproof glass. "You planned this whole thing." "I planned nothing," Greg replied calmly. "I simply documented your crimes and made sure the right people learned about them. Everything that's happening to you is the direct result of choices you made." Chad's face was gaunt from stress and fear. "Pollard's people are going to kill me." "Then you'd better hope the federal prosecutor offers you protective custody," Greg said, standing to leave. "Of course, that would require admitting to crimes you've spent weeks denying." "Wait," Chad called desperately. "What about Lynette? What are you going to do to her?" Greg paused at the door, considering the question. In truth, Lynette's destruction was already well underway through legal channels. Her assets frozen, her reputation ruined, her true identity exposed. But Chad didn't need to know that his ex-wife's fate was sealed. Lynette made her choice 4 years ago, Greg said finally. "She chose you over me because she thought you were the winner. Now she gets to live with the consequences of that choice." As Greg walked away from the jail, he felt the satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. But this was only the beginning. The evidence he'd inherited from his father contained enough ammunition to destroy not just Chad and Lynette, but the entire network of corruption they'd built around themselves. Justice, Greg reflected, was indeed just accounting, and he intended to balance these books down to the last penny. Chapter 5. The Network Falls. 3 weeks after Chad's arrest, Greg sat in the renovated penthouse office that had once belonged to his father. Hull Construction was officially under federal oversight while the investigation continued, but Greg's inheritance as majority shareholder gave him control over day-to-day operations. His first act had been to hire Amanda Chung, the psychiatrist who'd evaluated his father, as the company's new chief ethics officer. His second had been to schedule individual meetings with every employee who'd remained silent about Chad's crimes. Stuart Gleason arrived first, nervous sweat beading on his forehead despite the building's air conditioning. As the accounting manager who'd documented Chad's embezzlement, Stuart had been living in fear of retaliation for nearly 3 years. "Mr. Hull," Stuart began, "I want you to know I never wanted to be part of—" Greg raised a hand to stop him. "Stuart, you kept detailed records that helped expose my brother's crimes. That took courage, even if you were initially motivated by self-preservation." "I was terrified," Stuart admitted. "Chad threatened to frame me for the thefts if I ever said anything. He had connections everywhere: police, courts, politicians. I didn't think anyone would believe me." "I understand. But now I need you to help me understand something else." Greg pulled out a file folder containing bank records and shell company documentation. "These accounts show money flowing to companies that don't seem to exist. Can you walk me through how Chad was hiding the money laundering operations?" Over the next hour, Stuart detailed a sophisticated network of financial manipulation that went far beyond simple embezzlement. Chad had created a web of shell companies that existed only on paper, each designed to obscure the source and destination of illegal funds. Money from Pablo Pollard's criminal organization would enter through one company, be transferred through 6 others, then emerge as legitimate Hull Construction revenue. The genius of it, Stuart explained reluctantly, was that most of the individual transactions looked normal. A construction company receiving payment from subcontractors, paying suppliers, transferring funds for materials. Only when you mapped the entire network could you see it was all designed to wash dirty money. Greg nodded grimly. His brother had been more clever than he'd given him credit for, but cleverness without conscience was just another form of stupidity. That afternoon, Greg met with Detective Farley and 2 federal agents who'd joined the investigation. Agent Kirsten Levine from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and Agent Eduardo Crow from the DEA had been tracking Pablo Pollard's organization for 3 years without realizing Hull Construction was part of his operation. "Your brother's cooperation has been limited," Agent Levine said diplomatically. "He maintains his innocence despite overwhelming evidence." "Chad always did have trouble accepting responsibility," Greg replied. "But I might be able to help you understand the full scope of the network." He provided them with Harold's complete files, including surveillance photographs of Chad meeting with Pollard's lieutenants, detailed financial records showing money transfers, and copies of coded communications between Hull Construction and various criminal enterprises. "This is incredible," Agent Crow muttered, studying photographs of Chad shaking hands with known drug dealers. "We've been trying to map Pollard's money laundering operation for years. This gives us everything we need." "There's more," Greg said. "The corruption extends into city government. Councilman Terry McKee and Planning Commissioner Hugh Higgins have been taking bribes to fast-track construction permits for projects funded with dirty money." Agent Levine looked up sharply. "Do you have evidence of that?" Greg pulled out audio recordings his father had made during the final months of his life. Harold had suspected the bribes and used his connections to document meetings between Chad and the corrupt officials. The recordings were damning. Chad's voice clearly discussing payments to McKee and Higgins in exchange for expedited permits, and zoning variances. The officials' voices equally clear in accepting the arrangements and discussing specific amounts. Jesus, Detective Farley breathed. This is going to bring down half the city government. Only the corrupt half, Greg corrected. The honest officials will remain to rebuild what's been damaged. Within 48 hours, the investigation had expanded to include federal racketeering charges. McKee and Higgins were arrested at their homes in pre-dawn raids, while Hull Construction's offices were searched by teams of federal agents collecting evidence of the money laundering conspiracy. The local media had a field day. Headlines screamed about corruption at City Hall, organized crime infiltration of legitimate businesses, and the stunning fall of one of the region's most prominent families. Chad's mugshot appeared on the front page of every newspaper, his once confident smile replaced by the hollow stare of a man facing life in federal prison. But Greg's attention was focused on a different target. Lynette had hired Kenneth Herman, one of the city's most expensive criminal defense attorneys, despite claiming poverty in her divorce filings. Greg knew she had to be drawing on hidden assets, money that represented her share of Chad's criminal profits. Through Raphael Owen, who'd remained on Greg's payroll after Harold's death, Greg learned that Lynette was living in a luxury apartment under her real name, Linda Henderson. She'd abandoned the pretense of being Chad's grieving wife and was preparing to disappear entirely once the heat died down. She'd done it before with previous husbands, vanishing with stolen assets while leaving behind devastated families. But this time, she'd underestimated her target. Greg arranged to meet her at the apartment through a carefully orchestrated deception. Owen had contacted her claiming to represent a potential buyer for information about Chad's hidden assets, information that would be valuable to either the government or Pablo Pollard's organization. When Lynette opened the door expecting a corrupt private investigator, she found Greg standing in the hallway with a briefcase and a cold smile. "Hello, Linda," he said, using her real name. "We need to talk." Her mask of composed beauty cracked instantly, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "What do you want?" "Justice," Greg replied, stepping into the apartment uninvited, "and an accounting of everything you've stolen from my family." The apartment was expensively furnished with art and jewelry that couldn't have been purchased on Chad's legitimate salary. Greg recognized several pieces from their former home, items Lynette had claimed in the divorce settlement despite their connection to the Hull family heritage. "You can't prove anything," Lynette said, backing toward the bedroom where Greg assumed she kept either weapons or a go-bag for quick escapes. "Actually, I can prove everything." Greg opened the briefcase to reveal copies of financial records linking her to Chad's shell companies. "You weren't just his accomplice, Linda. You were his business partner from the beginning." The documents showed Lynette's real role in the conspiracy. She'd used her psychology background to identify potential corruption targets, manipulating city officials and business leaders into accepting bribes. Her charm and beauty had opened doors that remained closed to Chad's more obvious criminality. "You're going to prison," Greg continued calmly. "The only question is whether you serve your sentence in minimum security or maximum. That depends on how helpful you are to the federal investigators." Lynette's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she screamed. "Pablo Pollard doesn't forgive people who cooperate with police. Chad is already marked for death, and anyone who helps bring down his operation will be next. Then you'd better hope the FBI's witness protection program is as good as advertised," Greg replied, "because your only choice now is between federal prison and a shallow grave." As he left the apartment, Greg felt no satisfaction in Lynette's terror. She'd earned her fate through 4 years of choices that had destroyed innocent people for financial gain. Now she would face the consequences of those choices, just as Chad was learning to face his. But Greg's campaign of justice was far from over. The network of corruption his brother had built reached into organizations and institutions that would take months to unravel. Every thread needed to be followed, every crime documented, every criminal held accountable. The fallen prince was becoming the avenging angel, and his work had only just begun. Chapter 6: The Predator's Web. Raphael Owen's investigation into Lynette's background had uncovered a pattern that stretched back 15 years and crossed multiple state lines. Her real name was Linda Marie Henderson, but she'd operated under at least 6 different identities while systematically destroying the lives of wealthy men who'd made the mistake of trusting her. Greg studied the files in his restored office, each case folder representing a family devastated by Linda's manipulations. Her first victim had been Marcus Webb, a successful restaurant owner in Chicago. She'd married him under the name Lily Watkins, then divorced him after claiming domestic abuse and emptying his business accounts. Webb had committed suicide 6 months after losing everything, leaving behind 3 children who'd been turned against him through Linda's lies. The pattern was always the same. Identify a wealthy target, create a false identity, establish trust through charm and apparent vulnerability, then systematically isolate the victim from family and friends while gaining access to financial assets. The divorce would come with fabricated evidence of abuse, ensuring favorable settlements that left the men with nothing, while Linda disappeared with new identities and substantial wealth. She's not just a gold digger, Amanda Chung observed, reviewing the psychological profiles Raphael had compiled. She's a sociopathic predator who views human beings as resources to be exploited and discarded. Greg nodded grimly. The question is whether we can connect her to all these previous crimes. Most of the evidence is circumstantial, and some of these men are dead. Actually, Raphael said, I found something interesting. Linda made a mistake with her 4th victim, William Cross in Denver. She used the same social security number on 2 different marriage licenses, creating a paper trail that connects multiple identities. The implications were staggering. If they could prove Linda had committed marriage fraud across state lines, she'd face federal charges that could add decades to her sentence for the whole conspiracy crimes. Greg authorized Raphael to expand his investigation, using Harold's remaining cash reserves to dig deeper into Linda's criminal history. What they discovered over the next 2 weeks was even worse than they'd imagined. Linda hadn't just stolen money from her victims. She destroyed their relationships with their children through systematic psychological manipulation. Children were turned against their fathers through carefully planted suggestions of abuse and neglect. Business partnerships were sabotaged through whispered accusations of incompetence and dishonesty. Entire social circles were poisoned against the targets through Linda's masterful manipulation of sympathy and outrage. She's a one-woman hurricane, Raphael reported during their final briefing. Everywhere she goes, families and businesses are destroyed while she walks away richer and ready to start again. But Greg's investigation had revealed something else. Linda had never faced real consequences for her crimes. The men she destroyed had been too broken or too dead to pursue justice. Law enforcement agencies in different states had never connected the cases. She'd operated with impunity for 15 years, leaving a trail of devastation that stretched across the country. That was about to change. Greg arranged a meeting with Agent Levine and Detective Farley, presenting them with Raphael's complete investigation into Linda's criminal history. The evidence showed a clear pattern of interstate fraud, identity theft, and racketeering that gave federal prosecutors everything they needed to file additional charges. This is incredible work, Agent Levine said, studying the case files. We can tie her to at least 8 separate federal crimes across 5 states. She's looking at multiple life sentences even before we factor in her role with the whole conspiracy. There's something else, Greg said. She's been using the money from these crimes to fund other criminal enterprises. The shell companies Chad created weren't just washing money for Pablo Pollard. They were also laundering Linda's profits from marriage fraud operations. The revelation expanded the federal investigation yet again. Linda hadn't just been Chad's accomplice. She'd been running her own parallel criminal organization that used Hull Construction as a financial clearinghouse for multiple illegal enterprises. But Greg's most satisfying discovery came from an unexpected source. During the investigation, Raphael had interviewed several of Linda's previous victims' children, now adults who'd spent years believing their fathers were abusive monsters. When presented with evidence of Linda's true nature, many began to question the stories they'd been told. Sarah Webb, Marcus Webb's eldest daughter, called Greg personally after learning about the investigation. "I hated my father for 10 years before he killed himself," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I believed every lie that woman told about him. Now I know she murdered him as surely as if she'd pulled the trigger herself." Greg arranged for Sarah and several other victims' children to meet with federal prosecutors. Their testimony about Linda's psychological manipulation tactics provided crucial evidence for racketeering charges that could ensure she never had the opportunity to destroy another family. The web of corruption was finally being unraveled completely. Chad faced life in federal prison for money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy charges. The bribes to city officials had triggered a wider investigation that implicated dozens of contractors and government employees in a pay-to-play scheme that had been operating for years. Pablo Pollard's organization was being systematically dismantled as federal agents used Hull Construction's records to trace money laundering operations across the entire criminal network. Pollard himself had been arrested in a spectacular raid that yielded enough evidence to eliminate his organization permanently. But for Greg, the most important victory was Linda's complete destruction. She'd spent 15 years believing herself untouchable, superior to the men she'd manipulated and destroyed. Now she faced the rest of her life in federal prison, her true identity exposed, her criminal empire dismantled, her victims finally receiving justice. As Greg signed the final papers returning Hull Construction to legitimate operation, he reflected on the 4-year journey from homeless disgrace to victorious heir. The company his grandfather had built would survive and prosper, clean of the corruption that had nearly destroyed it. The fallen prince had reclaimed his throne, but more importantly, he'd ensure that the predators who tried to destroy his family would face consequences that matched their crimes. Justice, he'd learned, was indeed just accounting, and the books were finally balanced. Chapter 7. The Final Reckoning. 6 months after Chad's arrest, Greg stood in the federal courthouse watching his brother shuffle into the courtroom in shackles and an orange jumpsuit. The man who'd once commanded board meetings and political fundraisers now looked like a broken shell, his face gaunt from months of protective custody and his eyes constantly darting toward the gallery where Pablo Pollard's associates might be sitting. Judge Margie Allison, a no-nonsense veteran of the federal bench, reviewed the charges with methodical precision. Money laundering, racketeering conspiracy, bribery of public officials, tax evasion, and fraud, 23 separate federal charges that carried a combined maximum sentence of over 300 years. Chad's attorney, a harried public defender named Shane Jimenez, had already negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for his cooperation against other members of the conspiracy, Chad would receive a sentence of 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. "Mr. Hull," Judge Allison addressed Chad directly, "do you understand that by accepting this plea agreement, you are admitting guilt to all charges and waiving your right to appeal?" Chad's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand that your cooperation with federal investigators has placed you in considerable personal danger?" "Yes, Your Honor." Greg felt no satisfaction watching his brother's humiliation. This wasn't revenge. It was simply the natural consequence of choices Chad had made over years of criminal behavior. Justice didn't require Greg's emotional investment, only his commitment to seeing truth revealed and consequences enforced. The gallery was packed with reporters, victims of Chad's crimes, and federal agents who'd spent months unraveling the conspiracy. Near the front sat Sarah Webb and 3 other children of Linda's previous victims, finally witnessing accountability for the woman who destroyed their families. Linda herself, no longer pretending to be Lynette Hull, would face sentencing the following week. Her trial had been a media sensation, with prosecutor Gail Simons methodically presenting evidence of 15 years of marriage fraud, identity theft, and psychological manipulation. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding her guilty on all 47 federal charges. But today belonged to Chad's reckoning. "Before I impose sentence," Judge Allison continued, "I want to address the impact of your crimes on the community and your family. The corruption you facilitated damaged public trust in government institutions. The money laundering operation you enabled supported drug trafficking and violence that harmed countless innocent people. And your betrayal of family trust destroyed relationships that can never be fully repaired. Chad stood motionless as the judge's words washed over him. Greg wondered if his brother truly understood the magnitude of what he'd done, or if he still saw himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. However, the judge added, "Your cooperation has been substantial and valuable. Federal agents have indicated that your information led to the arrest and conviction of 37 additional defendants and a seizure of over $40 million in criminal assets." The cooperation had come at a cost. Pablo Pollard's organization had put a bounty on Chad's head that would follow him for the rest of his life. Even in federal prison, he needed protective custody to survive. "Chad Hull," Judge Allison announced, "I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison to be served in protective custody. You will also pay restitution of $12 million to victims of your crimes and forfeit all assets obtained through illegal activities." Chad swayed slightly as the sentence was imposed, but remained standing. Greg watched his brother's shoulders slump in acceptance of his fate, a quarter-century in a 6x8 cell, constantly looking over his shoulder for enemies who would never forgive his betrayal. As Chad was led away, Greg felt Detective Farley's hand on his shoulder. "Your father would be proud," Farley said quietly. "Justice was served here today." Greg nodded, but said nothing. Harold Hull's ghost could rest knowing that his company's honor had been restored and his true heir vindicated, but pride seemed like the wrong emotion for this moment. The following week brought Linda's sentencing, which proved even more dramatic than Chad's. She'd refused all plea agreements, maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Her trial had revealed the full scope of her predatory career, with victim after victim testifying about the devastation she'd caused. Judge Allison's sentencing speech was scathing. "Linda Henderson, you have spent 15 years destroying families through systematic manipulation and fraud. You have shown no remorse for your crimes and no recognition of the suffering you've caused. Your actions represent a level of calculated cruelty that demands the severest response." Linda received 4 consecutive life sentences plus 60 years, ensuring she would die in federal prison regardless of appeals or good behavior. The woman who believed herself untouchable was removed from society permanently. As the courtroom cleared after Linda's sentencing, Greg found himself alone with Raphael Owen, who'd been instrumental in documenting the evidence that made justice possible. "Any regrets?" Raphael asked. Greg considered the question carefully. "I regret that it took 4 years for the truth to surface. I regret that other people were hurt by their crimes. But I don't regret that they're facing consequences for their choices." "What about forgiveness?" "Some people would say you have an obligation to forgive family. Forgiveness requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing and genuine remorse," Greg replied. "Chad spent 4 years destroying my life through lies and manipulation. Linda spent 15 years destroying multiple families for profit. Neither has shown any remorse for their actions, only anger being caught." Raphael nodded thoughtfully. "What's next for you?" Greg looked out the courthouse window at the city where he'd been born, fallen from grace, and ultimately reclaimed his place. Hull Construction was thriving under his leadership, its reputation restored through transparent operations and ethical business practices. The company was currently building low-income housing projects and veterans rehabilitation centers, causes that would have horrified Chad's profit-obsessed worldview. "I rebuild what they tried to destroy," Greg said finally. "Not just the business, but the trust and integrity that should define the Hull name." 6 months later, Greg stood in the restored Hull Construction headquarters, looking at photographs of 3 generations of Hull men who'd built the company from nothing. His grandfather's portrait showed a man who'd started with a single concrete truck and built an empire through honest work and fair dealing. His father showed a leader who'd expanded that empire while maintaining the family's reputation for integrity. Greg's own portrait, recently commissioned, showed a man who'd learned that true strength came not from avoiding adversity, but from surviving it with principles intact. The company now employed over 200 people and had contracts worth $40 million, all of it legitimate business based on competitive bidding and quality work. Greg had established a charitable foundation that supported victims of domestic fraud and psychological manipulation, ensuring that Linda's future victims would have resources for recovery and justice. He'd never married again, though several women had expressed interest in the wealthy, eligible bachelor who'd overcome such dramatic adversity. Trust, once broken so completely, was difficult to rebuild even with innocent people. But Greg had found peace in solitude and purpose in his work. Every successful project, every ethical business deal, every family helped by his foundation represented a victory over the forces that had tried to destroy him. The fallen prince had not just reclaimed his throne. He'd proven himself worthy of it through trials that would have broken a lesser man. And unlike the fairy tales, this story ended not with forgiveness and reconciliation, but with justice served and accounts balanced. Some betrayals were too profound for forgiveness. Some crimes demanded consequences that lasted a lifetime. Greg Hull had learned that mercy without justice was merely weakness, and that true strength sometimes required the courage to walk away from those who'd proven themselves unworthy of redemption. In the end, the price of betrayal had been paid in full, and Greg Hull could finally rest knowing that the dead were avenged and the living were protected from predators who'd learned too late that some men could not be broken, only strengthened by the trials they endured. Chapter 8. The Network's End. 1 year after the trials, Greg received an unexpected visitor at his office. Agent Kirsten Levine arrived with a thick file folder and the satisfied expression of someone who just closed a career-defining case. "The Pablo Pollard investigation is officially complete," she announced, setting the folder on Greg's desk. "I thought you'd want to see the final numbers." Greg opened the file to find a comprehensive summary of the criminal network's destruction. Pollard himself was serving life without parole after his organization's money laundering operation was exposed through Hull Construction's records. 63 associates had been arrested, tried, and convicted on various federal charges. Over $80 million in criminal assets have been seized and returned to victims. "Your brother's cooperation was instrumental," Agent Levine continued. Despite the personal danger, he provided information that led to arrests across 5 states and 2 countries. Greg felt no warmth toward Chad, despite his cooperation. Fear of Pablo Pollard's revenge had motivated his brother's assistance, not genuine remorse for his crimes. Chad was serving his sentence in protective custody at a federal prison in Colorado, where he would remain for the next 24 years. "What about the city corruption cases?" Greg asked. "Complete victory there as well. Terry McKee and Hugh Higgins both received 15-year sentences. The investigation expanded to include 12 other city employees who were taking bribes or kickbacks. The entire planning and zoning department has been restructured with new oversight procedures." The corruption cases have been personally satisfying for Greg, who'd watched honest contractors struggle to compete against companies that bought their approvals through bribes. Hull Construction's current success was built on merit rather than corruption, a fact that made every victory more meaningful. But the most important update concerned Linda Henderson's appeals. She exhausted her final appeal last month, Agent Levine reported. The Supreme Court declined to hear her case. She'll spend the rest of her life in federal prison, and her conviction has inspired investigations in 12 other states where she operated under different identities. Greg nodded grimly. Justice delayed was justice denied, but justice served completely was something approaching closure. "There's one more thing," Agent Levine added, pulling out a smaller file. "We recovered additional assets hidden in offshore accounts Linda established under various false identities. The total comes to just over $6 million. Restitution for her victims? Already distributed. Marcus Webb's children received substantial settlements, as did the families of her other victims. Your testimony about her psychological manipulation tactics was crucial in securing those judgments." Greg had testified at several victim restitution hearings, describing Linda's methods and the long-term damage she'd caused through systematic psychological abuse. Seeing the relief on victims' families' faces had been more satisfying than any financial compensation. After Agent Levine left, Greg walked through Hull Construction's offices, observing the honest work being done by people who'd rebuilt their careers after Chad's criminal leadership. Stuart Gleason had been promoted to chief financial officer after proving his integrity during the federal investigation. Amanda Chung had implemented ethics training programs that ensured future corruption would be impossible. The company's current projects reflected Greg's values rather than Chad's greed. They were building affordable housing for veterans, renovating schools in low-income neighborhoods, and constructing a new hospital wing that would serve the city's most vulnerable populations. Every project was bid competitively and completed within budget, restoring the whole name's reputation for excellence and integrity. That evening, Greg visited his father's grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone read simply, Harold Hull, 1951 to 2024, beloved father and businessman. No mention of the mistakes that had nearly destroyed his legacy, only acknowledgement of the man who'd ultimately chosen truth over comfort. "It's finished, Dad," Greg said quietly, placing fresh flowers on the grave. "The company is clean, the criminals are in prison, and justice has been served. You can rest now." A light rain began to fall as Greg walked back to his car, washing the dust from his father's headstone and the courthouse steps where Chad and Linda had been sentenced. The city looked different now, cleaner somehow, as if the removal of corruption had allowed honest growth to flourish. Greg's phone buzzed with a text from Raphael Owen. "Pollard found dead in his cell this morning. Apparent suicide, but federal investigators are treating it as suspicious. Thought you should know." Greg deleted the message without responding. Pablo Pollard's death, whether suicide or murder, was justice of a different kind. The inevitable result of a criminal lifestyle that made enemies of everyone who mattered. Greg felt no satisfaction in the crime boss's demise, only relief that another dangerous predator had been permanently removed from society. The rain intensified as Greg drove through the city center, past the construction sites where Hull construction crews were building legitimately acquired projects, past the courthouse where justice had been served through proper legal channels, past the homeless shelter where Greg had once slept, now renovated with funds from his charitable foundation. For years ago, he'd been a broken man who'd lost everything through others' lies and manipulations. Tonight, he was a successful businessman who'd restored his family's honor through patience, planning, and unwavering commitment to truth. The fallen prince had become something better than royalty. He'd become a man who understood that true power came from integrity rather than corruption, from justice rather than revenge, from building rather than destroying. His enemies were imprisoned or dead, their criminal networks dismantled, their victims compensated. The accounts were balanced, the books closed, the story complete. Greg Hull drove home through the rain, satisfied that he'd proven the most important truth of all. Some men could be broken by betrayal, but others were only strengthened by it, tempered like steel in the fire of adversity until they became unbreakable instruments of justice. The price of betrayal had been paid in full, and Greg Hull could finally move forward knowing that the innocent were protected and the guilty had faced consequences that matched their crimes. Justice, after all, was just accounting, and these books were permanently closed. Chapter 9. Legacy of Justice. 5 years after Harold Hull's funeral, Greg stood on the balcony of his penthouse office, looking out over a city transformed by the removal of systemic corruption. Hull Construction had become the region's largest employer, with over 500 employees working on projects that serve the community rather than criminal enterprises. The company's motto, displayed prominently in the lobby, read simply, "Built on truth, founded on honor." The transformation hadn't been easy. Rebuilding trust after Chad's criminal leadership had required years of transparent operations, ethical business practices, and community engagement. Every contract was bid openly, every project completed within budget, every employee held to the highest standards of integrity. Greg's secretary, Nina Gill, knocked on his door, carrying the morning's mail and newspapers. At 62, Nina had worked for Hull Construction for 30 years, surviving both Chad's criminal period and the company's rebirth under Greg's leadership. "The morning papers," she said, setting down copies of local and national publications. "You might want to see the front page of the Tribune." The headline read, "Hull Construction wins National Ethics Award for Business Excellence." The article described Greg's transformation of the company from criminal enterprise to community pillar, highlighting the charitable foundation's work with fraud victims and the company's commitment to rebuilding trust through transparent operations. 5 years ago, Hull Construction was synonymous with corruption and scandal, the article stated. Today, under Greg Hull's leadership, it represents the highest standards of business ethics and community service. This remarkable transformation demonstrates that redemption is possible even after the most serious betrayals of public trust. Greg set the paper aside without reading the full article. Media attention made him uncomfortable, but he understood its value in demonstrating that legitimate business could be more successful than criminal enterprises. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Webb, Marcus Webb's daughter, who became a victims' rights advocate after her father's vindication, saw the article. "Dad would be proud that his death led to something positive. Thank you for making sure Linda paid for what she did to all of us." Similar messages have been arriving all morning from victims' families, former employees, and community leaders who'd watched Greg's methodical restoration of his family's reputation. The fallen prince had become something unexpected, a symbol of redemption through justice rather than forgiveness. But the most significant message came from an unexpected source. "Mr. Hull," Nina said, returning with a formal letter bearing federal letterhead. "This just arrived by special courier." The letter was from Agent Levine, now promoted to supervise the FBI's white-collar crime division. "Dear Mr. Hull, I wanted to inform you personally that Linda Henderson died in federal prison yesterday evening. Official cause of death was complications from cancer, though she'd been refusing treatment for several months. She maintained her innocence until the end and expressed no remorse for her crimes. Her death closes the final chapter on one of the most complex fraud cases in federal history. 15 families received justice because of your courage in exposing her true nature and providing evidence of her criminal pattern. The investigative techniques developed during her case have been used to identify and prosecute 17 other marriage fraud predators operating across the country. Chad Hull remains in protective custody and has reportedly found religion during his incarceration. He's expressed interest in speaking with you, though I understand if you prefer to maintain no contact. Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished. Justice served through proper channels is always preferable to vigilante revenge, and your commitment to legal processes helped ensure that dangerous criminals faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. Respectfully, Agent Kirsten Levine. Greg folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer alongside other correspondence from the various legal proceedings. Linda's death felt like the closing of a book he'd never asked to read, a final punctuation mark on a story of betrayal, justice, and redemption. He'd felt no satisfaction when Chad was sentenced, no triumph when Linda received life imprisonment, and no pleasure in learning of her death. Justice wasn't about emotional catharsis. It was about ensuring that consequences matched choices and that society was protected from those who'd proven themselves dangerous. That afternoon, Greg received another unexpected visitor. Stuart Gleason, now Hull Construction's chief financial officer, knocked on his door with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Greg, you need to see this," Stuart said, spreading financial reports across the conference table. "We just closed the biggest quarter in company history. Legitimate profits, ethical practices, competitive bidding, everything your grandfather would have wanted." The numbers were impressive. Hull Construction's annual revenue had reached $75 million, surpassing even the inflated figures from Chad's criminal period. More importantly, every dollar had been earned honestly through quality work and fair dealing. "There's something else," Stewart continued. "The Veterans Rehabilitation Center we built last year has been nominated for a National Architecture Award. The low-income housing project received recognition from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We're not just successful, we're making a difference. Greg studied the reports with satisfaction. Success built on integrity was more valuable than wealth obtained through corruption, though it had taken years to prove that principle in practice. As the afternoon wore on, Greg found himself thinking about Chad's request for a meeting. His brother had been imprisoned for 5 years, serving his sentence in protective custody while helping federal investigators dismantle the remains of Pablo Pollard's organization. By all accounts, he'd become a model prisoner who'd found religion and expressed remorse for his crimes. But remorse offered after punishment was meaningless. Chad's cooperation with authorities had been motivated by fear rather than conscience, and his conversion in prison was likely another manipulation designed to improve his circumstances. Greg had learned that forgiveness required genuine repentance, while justice demanded that consequences match choices. Chad had chosen betrayal, corruption, and criminality. He would serve his full sentence regardless of his current claims of redemption. That evening, Greg attended the annual Hull Foundation Charity Gala, an event that raised money for victims of financial fraud and domestic abuse. The ballroom was filled with business leaders, politicians, and community activists who'd supported his efforts to restore the Hull name's reputation. The keynote speaker was Dr. Amanda Chung, who'd left her psychology practice to become a full-time advocate for fraud victims. Her speech focused on the long-term psychological damage caused by financial predators and the importance of legal accountability in the healing process. Justice delayed is justice denied, she said, but justice served completely allows victims to reclaim their lives and trust in social institutions. The Hull Foundation exists because Greg Hull understood that protecting future victims is more important than satisfying past grievances. The foundation had grown beyond Greg's initial vision. It now operated victim support centers in 12 states, provided legal assistance for fraud prosecutions, and funded research into the psychological techniques used by financial predators. Last year alone, it had helped convict 43 marriage fraud criminals and recovered over $20 million for their victims. As the gala concluded, Greg reflected on the journey from homeless disgrace to community leader. The fallen prince had discovered that true nobility came not from inherited position, but from earned respect, not from avoiding adversity, but from overcoming it with principles intact. His enemies were imprisoned or dead, their criminal networks dismantled, their victims compensated and protected. The Hull name represented honor rather than corruption, service rather than exploitation, justice rather than revenge. Greg had never remarried, never had children, never built the traditional family that might have motivated different choices. But he built something more lasting, a legacy of integrity that would survive long after he was gone. The accounts were balanced, the books permanently closed, the story complete. Greg Hull had proven that some betrayals created strength rather than weakness, that justice served properly was more satisfying than revenge, and that the price of betrayal, once paid in full, allowed the innocent to move forward while the guilty faced consequences that matched their crimes. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was justice. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Hello, and welcome back to Infidelity Tales Lab. We're grateful for each view and comment. Tell us, from which country or city are you watching today? We enjoy connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Golden Cage. Victor Mercer stared at his bank statement, his jaw clenched. Another month, another depleted account. As a biotech research scientist with a hefty salary, he should have been financially comfortable. Instead, he found himself counting pennies for lunch while his wife, Diana, splurged on her 5th designer handbag this month. "Diana, we need to talk," Victor said, finding his wife lounging by their pool in their upscale San Diego home. Diana Lowell Mercer, a former pharmaceutical sales representative who had quit her job 3 years into their marriage, barely looked up from her magazine. About what? She asked, her tone disinterested. The finances. I checked our joint account. You withdrew $8,000 yesterday. Diana removed her sunglasses, her blue eyes narrowing. Your point? My point? That's almost half my monthly take-home pay. Where did it go? I had expenses, Victor. Besides, what's yours is mine. Isn't that what you promised? Her smile was honeyed, but held no warmth. Or are you suddenly regretting our arrangement? The arrangement had begun innocently enough. When they married 7 years ago, Diana had suggested combining their finances, which seemed reasonable. She'd offered to manage their money since Victor was often absorbed in his research. Gradually, she'd taken complete control of his paychecks, doling out an allowance that barely covered his basic needs. I'm not regretting our marriage, Victor said carefully, but I think we need more transparency. I'd like access to our investment accounts. Diana's laugh was brittle. Oh, Victor, you're brilliant with your test tubes, but you'd be lost managing real money. Trust me, I'm taking care of everything. Later that evening, Victor received a call from his mother. Victor, your father and I are concerned, Ellen Mercer began. Diana called us. She says you're becoming paranoid about money. Victor pinched the bridge of his nose. Mom, she's controlling all my earnings. I just asked to see our accounts. Son, his father Robert's stern voice came on the line. Diana's been nothing but devoted to you. Remember how she stuck by you during that plagiarism accusation at your old lab? You've always been intense. Maybe you're working too hard again. The mention of the plagiarism incident, where Victor had been falsely accused and later exonerated, stung. His parents had initially doubted his innocence, just as Diana had seemed to. Only Victor's former colleague Noah Fleming had stood by him, helping prove someone else had stolen Victor's research. I'm not working too hard, Victor replied evenly. I'm trying to understand where my money is going. His mother sighed. Diana mentioned you've been forgetting things, too. Missing appointments. Maybe you should see Dr. Winters again. Dr. Winters, the psychiatrist Victor had seen briefly after the plagiarism stress. A chill ran down his spine. Why would Diana bring that up now? After hanging up, Victor sat in his home office, thinking. His parents had always favored Diana, viewing her as the stable counterpart to their difficult son. But this felt different, more coordinated. That night, Victor pretended to take the sleeping pill Diana had begun helpfully providing each evening. Once she was asleep, he slipped in her home office and tried accessing her computer. Locked. Her desk drawers, also locked. But underneath a stack of mail, he found a receipt from an attorney named Philip Vaughn, dated 3 days earlier. Victor photographed it with his phone, then carefully replaced everything. Something was very wrong, and he needed to figure out what before confronting Diana. The next day, he called Noah. I need a favor, Victor said after explaining his concerns. Can you recommend a good private investigator? Something's happening, and I need to know what I'm dealing with. Noah didn't hesitate. I know someone discreet. But Victor, if what you suspect is true, are you prepared for what you might discover? Victor's voice hardened. Whatever it is, I'd rather face it head-on than be blindsided. Little did he know how prophetic those words would be. Chapter 2. Paper Trails and Broken Vows. The private investigator, Brendan Russo, met Victor at a nondescript diner 15 miles from his home. Victor had been careful. He told Diana he was meeting with a potential research collaborator and made sure to arrive early to spot any familiar faces. Your wife has been busy, Russo said, sliding a folder across the table after they'd ordered coffee. Very busy. The contents turned Victor's stomach. Bank statements showed Diana had been systematically moving funds from their joint accounts into private accounts under her maiden name. Over the past year alone, she diverted nearly $300,000. There's more, Russo continued. She's been seeing someone regularly. The photographs were unmistakable. Diana entering an upscale downtown apartment building. Diana at restaurants, her hand intertwined with a man's. Diana kissing the same man on a hotel balcony. His name is Adrian Walsh, financial advisor. They've been together at least 8 months, possibly longer. Victor stared at the man in the photos. Tall, polished, with the practiced smile of someone who charmed for a living. And my parents? You mentioned phone records. Frequent calls between your wife and both your parents increased significantly in the past 3 weeks. She also had multiple meetings with an attorney named Philip Vaughn. He specializes in competency hearings and conservatorship. The pieces clicked into place. The questions about his mental state. The forgetfulness Diana kept mentioning to others. The sudden concern from his parents about him working too hard. They're building a case to have me declared incompetent, Victor said flatly. Russo nodded. Based on what I've found, that's my assessment. The typical strategy is to claim the subject is mentally unstable, unable to manage their affairs, and potentially a danger to themselves. If successful, they'd control all your assets and decisions. Victor's mind raced through the implications. His research was nearing a breakthrough, a new delivery system for targeted cancer therapies. If his patent applications came through, the royalties would be substantial. What about this Walsh character? Any connection beyond the affair? That's where it gets interesting, Russo said, flipping to another page. Walsh previously worked at Helix Financial, where he managed portfolios for wealthy clients. He left under a cloud, rumors of account mismanagement, though nothing was proven. One of his former clients was Robert Mercer. My father, Victor whispered. Your father lost a significant amount with Walsh's firm, but apparently maintained a relationship. My guess. Walsh connected with your wife through your father, though whether the financial scheme or the affair came first is unclear. Victor sat back, processing this betrayal's multiple layers. His wife, his parents, and this financial predator, all conspiring to strip him of his autonomy and wealth. What's their timeline? Victor asked. Based on the legal filings I accessed, they've scheduled a competency hearing for next Friday. Judge Patricia Reynolds presiding. 9 days, Victor murmured. He met Russo's eyes. I need everything you've gathered, plus anything else you can find on Walsh. And I need a recommendation for the best attorney in town for this situation. Russo nodded. Already compiled. And for legal counsel, you want Veronica Sandoval. Former prosecutor turned defense attorney. Specializes in complex family cases with financial components. She's expensive but worth every penny. Money isn't an issue, Victor said grimly. Not yet, anyway. Later that day, Victor made 2 crucial moves. First, he withdrew $50,000 from a private research grant account only he could access, funds Diana knew nothing about. Second, he contacted Veronica Sandoval and arranged an immediate meeting. Sandoval's office was minimalist and intimidating, much like the woman herself. In her mid-50s with steel gray hair and penetrating dark eyes, she reviewed Victor's evidence in silence before speaking. They've made critical errors, she said finally. Conspiring to falsely have someone declare incompetent is illegal, but proving it requires irrefutable evidence and perfect timing. What do you recommend? Counterfiling immediately would alert them. Instead, we prepare thoroughly and reveal our hand only at the hearing. Meanwhile, you need to secure your most critical assets and research without raising suspicion. Victor leaned forward. I want more than just protection. When this is over, I want them to face consequences. Sandoval's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes sharpened. To what extent? Maximum legal damage, Victor replied. And perhaps beyond that, depending on what else we discover. Be careful what you wish for, Dr. Mercer. Revenge tends to consume the vengeful. Victor's smile was cold. I'm a researcher, Miss Sandoval. I understand controlled experiments and measure responses. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice and consequences. As Victor left Sandoval's office, his phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Where are you? Your mother's been trying to reach you. We're worried. The performance had begun. Chapter 3. The trap is set. Victor maintained a perfect facade. For the next 7 days, he played the role of the oblivious husband, pretending not to notice Diana's whispered phone calls or the way she documented his every unusual behavior in a small notebook she thought he hadn't discovered. Meanwhile, he executed his countermeasures with surgical precision. First, he secured his research. Victor transferred all his critical data to encrypted drives and sent copies to a trusted colleague abroad. He also filed accelerated patent applications through a separate attorney, ensuring his intellectual property was protected regardless of the hearing's outcome. Second, he gathered evidence. Small cameras installed in their home captured Diana's conversations about the plot. A recording device in his own home office documented her searching his computer while he was at work. Most damning was the audio of Diana coaching his parents on what to say at the hearing. Remember to mention how he accused colleagues of stealing his work. Diana's voice instructed Victor's father during one recorded call. And Mom emphasized his mood swings, how he seems paranoid one day and manic the next. Are you sure this is necessary, Diana? Ellen Mercer had asked, a hint of doubt in her voice. Declaring our own son incompetent seems extreme. It's for his own good, Diana insisted. Victor's brilliant but unstable. And honestly, with the value of his upcoming patents, we can't risk him making irrational decisions. This way, we protect him and his assets. And the financial advisor you mentioned, Walsh, he'll help manage everything afterward? Robert Mercer asked. Adrian has excellent investment strategies. He'll triple Victor's patent royalties within 5 years, and we'll all benefit. Third, Victor investigated deeper. Brendan Russo uncovered that Walsh had been orchestrating similar schemes with at least 2 other wealthy clients, working with different female accomplices each time. In one case, a tech entrepreneur had been institutionalized for 6 months before relatives discovered the fraud. The morning of the hearing, Victor awoke to find Diana sitting on the edge of their bed, her expression concerned. Victor, honey, I need you to stay calm today, she said, placing her hand on his. Your parents and I have arranged a meeting with Judge Reynolds. It's just a welfare check, nothing to worry about. A welfare check? Victor repeated, feigning confusion. Yes, darling, we're concerned about you. The forgetfulness, the accusations about money, it's not like you. Her eyes welled with practiced tears. We just want to make sure you're okay. Victor nodded slowly. I see. Well, if you're all so concerned, of course I'll come. Diana's relief was palpable and revealing. She'd expected resistance, perhaps even an outburst she could document as further evidence of his instability. I'll lay out your blue suit, she said, standing up. Judge Reynolds is a friend of Adrian Walsh. You remember Adrian from my charity committee? They're both on the hospital board. Another piece of the puzzle. The judge had a connection to Walsh. Victor texted this information to Sandoval as soon as Diana left the room. The response came immediately, already aware. Adds to our motion for recusal. Follow the plan exactly. At the courthouse, Victor was surprised to see Noah Fleming waiting in the parking lot. What are you doing here? Victor asked as Noah approached. Veronica Sandoval called me. Said you might need moral support. Noah's expression was grim. Is it true? Diana and your parents. Victor nodded. And worse than you think. But it ends today. Inside, Diana led Victor to a conference room where his parents waited with a polished man in an expensive suit, undoubtedly Philip Vaughn, and another man Victor recognized from the photographs as Adrian Walsh. Victor, Robert Mercer stood, his expression a mask of paternal concern. We're here because we love you, son. Ellen Mercer dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. This intervention is long overdue. Your behavior has become so erratic. Intervention? Victor raised an eyebrow. I thought Diana called this a welfare check. An uncomfortable silence fell. Diana recovered first. It's both, darling. We're checking on your welfare through an intervention. Adrian Walsh stepped forward, extending his hand. Victor, I'm Adrian Walsh. I've been consulting with your family about the best approach to helping you. Victor ignored the outstretched hand. And what expertise do you have in mental health, Mr. Walsh? Walsh faltered slightly. I'm a financial advisor. My concern is protecting your assets while you recover. I see. Victor checked his watch. What time is Judge Reynolds joining us? Philip Vaughn cleared his throat. The judge will see us in her chambers at 11. We're filing a petition for temporary conservatorship, with your wife as conservator and your parents as backup conservators. Victor nodded calmly. And who's representing my interests in this petition? The question seemed to catch them off guard. Vaughn recovered first. As this is an emergency petition based on incapacity, you haven't been assigned counsel yet. But rest assured, the court will appoint someone appropriate afterward. How convenient, Victor remarked. Diana moved to his side, taking his arm. Victor, please don't be difficult. We're trying to help you. When exactly did my alleged incapacity begin, Diana? Before or after you started sleeping with Mr. Walsh here? The room went deadly silent. Robert Mercer's face flushed red, while Ellen gasped. Diana's fingers dug into Victor's arm. That's exactly the kind of paranoid accusation we're concerned about, Vaughn interjected smoothly. These delusions, are they delusions? Victor asked, pulling out his phone. Because I have quite a collection of photos suggesting otherwise. Would you like to see them, Dad? Mom? There's a particularly interesting one from the Bayshore Hotel last Thursday. Diana's face had gone pale. Victor, you're not well. This is... The door opened, and a court officer appeared. Judge Reynolds is ready for you now. As they gathered their things, Victor leaned close to Diana and whispered, You should have been more careful about who you trusted, Diana. Much more careful. For the first time, genuine fear flickered in her eyes as they walked toward the judge's chambers, where everything was about to change. Chapter 4. Tables Turned. Judge Patricia Reynolds' chambers were imposing. Dark wood paneling, law books lining the walls, and an American flag standing beside her massive desk. The judge herself, a severe-looking woman in her 60s with immaculately styled silver hair, barely looked up from her papers as they entered. Competency hearing in the matter of Victor Mercer, she announced. Understand this is an emergency petition filed by Diana Mercer, with supporting statements from Robert and Ellen Mercer. That's correct, Your Honor, Philip Vaughn confirmed. We have substantial documentation of Dr. Mercer's declining mental state and erratic behavior. Judge Reynolds peered over her reading glasses. And Dr. Mercer is present without counsel? Before Vaughn could answer, the door opened again. Veronica Sandoval strode in, followed by Brendan Russo and two court officers carrying boxes of documents. Veronica Sandoval, representing Dr. Victor Mercer, she announced, placing a thick folder on the judge's desk. And I'm filing an immediate motion to dismiss this petition on grounds of fraud upon the court, conspiracy to commit financial exploitation, and judicial recusal due to conflict of interest. Judge Reynolds' eyebrows shot up. Ms. Sandoval, this is highly irregular. This was scheduled as an uncontested competency hearing. There's nothing regular about this case, Your Honor, Sandoval replied, and nothing about it is uncontested. If I may. When the judge nodded cautiously, Sandoval continued. First, we move for your recusal based on your relationship with Adrian Walsh, who is not only the paramour of the petitioner, but stands to gain financially from controlling Dr. Mercer's assets. Diana gasped audibly. Adrian Walsh stood rigid, while Philip Vaughn began furiously scribbling notes. Judge Reynolds' face had gone pale. That's a serious allegation, counselor. Which we can substantiate, Sandoval replied, nodding to one of the court officers, who handed her a document. This is a photograph from the Westlake Country Club Charity Gala 3 months ago, showing Your Honor, Mr. Walsh, and, coincidentally, Mrs. Mercer deep in conversation. Our filing includes bank records showing a $50,000 donation from an LLC controlled by Mr. Walsh to Your Honor's re-election campaign 2 weeks later. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. I attend numerous fundraisers, Ms. Sandoval. Of course, Your Honor. However, the appearance of impropriety is sufficient grounds for recusal. But more importantly, we have evidence that this entire petition is fraudulent. Sandoval signaled, and Brendan Russo stepped forward with a laptop. With the court's permission, we'd like to play several recordings that demonstrate a conspiracy between Diana Mercer, Adrian Walsh, and the elder Mercers to falsely have Dr. Victor Mercer declared incompetent for financial gain. Robert Mercer surged to his feet. This is outrageous. We're trying to help our son. By conspiring to steal his money and research patents? Victor asked quietly. That's an interesting definition of help, Dad. Philip Vaughn raised his hand. Your Honor, any recordings made without consent would be inadmissible under California's two-party consent law. Normally, you'd be correct, Sandoval replied. However, These recordings fall under the exception for gathering evidence of felony fraud. Furthermore, several were made in public places where there's no expectation of privacy. Judge Reynolds looked increasingly uncomfortable. I think, given these allegations, this matter should be transferred to another judge. We anticipated that, Your Honor, Sandoval said. We've already filed a comprehensive brief with presiding Judge Morris, who has assigned Judge William Hargrove to hear this matter immediately. He's waiting in courtroom 3C. Diana turned to Victor, her composure cracking. Victor, please. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand perfectly, Victor replied, his voice low. You, Walsh, and my parents plotted to have me declared incompetent so that you could control my assets and upcoming patent royalties. You've been systematically gaslighting me, stealing from me, and betraying me in every possible way. Adrian Walsh stepped forward. Dr. Mercer, there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply providing financial advice. Save it for Judge Hargrove. Victor cut him off. I'm particularly interested in how you'll explain your previous clients who mysteriously lost capacity shortly after meeting you, like Thomas Bergman or Elizabeth Winters. Walsh's face went ashen at the mention of those names. 20 minutes later, they reassembled in courtroom 3C. Judge William Hargrove, a barrel-chested black man with a reputation for zero tolerance for courtroom games, listened impassively as Sandoval laid out their evidence. The recordings were damning. Diana's voice, crystal clear, discussing how to manufacture evidence of Victor's instability. Adrian Walsh explaining how they'd manage Victor's assets once he was declared incompetent. Robert Mercer expressing concern about the ethics, but ultimately agreeing after Walsh mentioned tripling returns. As the final recording played, Diana and Walsh in bed, laughing about how Victor would be comfortably managed in a private facility while they enjoyed his money. Diana buried her face in her hands. Your Honor, Sandoval concluded, we're not only asking for dismissal of the incompetency petition, but also filing counterclaims for conspiracy, fraud, emotional distress, and theft. Additionally, we've provided this evidence to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. Judge Hargrove turned to Philip Vaughn. Counselor, do you wish to respond? Vaughn stood, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Your Honor, in light of this evidence, my clients may wish to reconsider their petition. Perhaps a brief recess. Not so fast. Judge Hargrove interrupted. This court takes allegations of abuse of the competency process extremely seriously. I'm dismissing the petition with prejudice and issuing temporary restraining orders against Diana Mercer, Adrian Walsh, Robert Mercer, and Ella Mercer, barring them from contact with Dr. Victor Mercer or access to any of his financial accounts. He turned to Victor. Dr. Mercer, are you currently residing in the same household as your wife? Yes, Your Honor. That arrangement needs to change immediately. Ms. Sandoval, I'm ordering that Mrs. Mercer vacate the shared residence within 24 hours. Dr. Mercer may return with a police escort to ensure compliance. Diana finally found her voice. But where am I supposed to go? That's my home. Judge Hargrove fixed her with a stern gaze. Mrs. Mercer, based on the evidence presented, you've been engaged in a scheme that could have resulted in your husband's false imprisonment in a psychiatric facility while you depleted his assets. Consider yourself fortunate that you're simply being ordered to find alternative housing rather than facing immediate criminal charges. He addressed the entire courtroom. This matter is referred to the district attorney for potential prosecution. All of Dr. Mercer's financial accounts are to be frozen except for his personal access. A full forensic accounting will determine what funds have been misappropriated. As the judge stood to leave, Victor caught Diana's eye. Her expression shifted from shock to calculation to something like pleading. Victor simply turned away. Outside the courtroom, Noah clasped Victor's shoulder. You okay? Victor watched as Diana huddled with Walsh and his parents, all of them shooting worried glances his way. I'm better than okay, Victor replied. But this is just the beginning. Chapter 5. The Architect of Ruin. 2 weeks after the court hearing, Victor sat in Veronica Sandoval's office, reviewing their strategy. The initial victory had been satisfying but incomplete. Diana had vacated their home, taking several valuable items despite the court order, and his parents had retreated to their lakeside cabin, all communication now routed through attorneys. Adrian Walsh, however, had disappeared completely. The district attorney is pursuing charges against Diana for financial exploitation and conspiracy, Sandoval explained. Your parents will likely face lesser charges as accessories, though their attorneys are positioning them as unwitting participants manipulated by Walsh. And Walsh himself? Sandoval frowned. That's where it gets complicated. The FBI has taken interest based on similar patterns with his other clients. They believe he's operating a sophisticated elder fraud ring, but he's vanished. Accounts emptied, apartment vacated, even his luxury car abandoned at the airport. Victor leaned back in his chair. He won't stay hidden for long. What makes you so confident? Because I know where he keeps his real money, Victor replied. The accounts he emptied were just for show. His actual wealth is tied up in cryptocurrency and offshore accounts. Information I acquired during our investigation. Sandoval looked alarmed. Victor, if you have information pertinent to a federal investigation, I've shared everything relevant with the FBI, Victor assured her. But some details I've kept in reserve. Insurance, you might say. Be careful, Sandoval warned. You've won the legal battle. Don't jeopardize that by pursuing personal vengeance. Victor smiled thinly. It's not vengeance, Veronica. It's justice. After leaving Sandoval's office, Victor met with Noah at a secure location, a private office Noah had rented under his company's name. Phase 1 is complete, Victor told him. The legal system has acknowledged their conspiracy and is pursuing conventional justice. Now we move to Phase 2. Noah looked concerned. Are you sure about this, Victor? You could walk away now, focus on your research. You've exposed them, cleared your name, protected your assets, and let them potentially plea bargain to minimal consequences? Victor shook his head. Diana might serve 6 months in a minimum security facility before resuming her life. My parents will probably get probation, claiming they were misled. And Walsh has a history of evading consequences altogether. What exactly are you planning? Noah asked. Justice tailored to each betrayal, Victor replied, opening his laptop to show a detailed flowchart. Diana took my trust and financial security. My parents chose her over their own son. Walsh orchestrated the entire scheme, pretending to care about vulnerable people while plotting to exploit them. And you're going to what? Become judge, jury, and executioner? Nothing so dramatic, Victor assured him, just ensuring that their punishments fit their crimes. Over the next month, Victor methodically executed his plan. First, he focused on his parents. As he'd predicted, they'd hired expensive attorneys who negotiated reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Diana and Walsh. Victor anonymously delivered comprehensive evidence packets to every member of his parents' social circle, their church congregation, and Robert's business partners. The packets contained court transcripts, recordings, and financial documentation proving their willing participation in the scheme against their son. Within weeks, they were socially ostracized. Robert's business partners initiated a forced buyout at a fraction of his stake's value, citing moral turpitude clauses. Their church asked them to step down from leadership positions. Neighbors avoided them. The court of public opinion proved far harsher than the legal system. For Diana, Victor employed a different approach. Her greatest fear had always been social humiliation and financial insecurity. Through carefully timed information releases to social media influencers in their circle, her affair and fraud attempt became trending gossip in their community. Simultaneously, Victor's attorney filed civil suits against her for financial recovery, placing liens on any future income or assets. He also ensured that her past educational fraud, she'd falsified portions of her pharmaceutical sales credentials, reached her former employer and industry contacts, effectively blacklisting her professionally. But Adrian Walsh remained Victor's primary target. The man had destroyed multiple lives with his schemes, and conventional justice had repeatedly failed to stop him. Working with Brendan Russo and specialized cybersecurity experts, Victor tracked Walsh's digital footprint to a small coastal town in Portugal. Using the cryptocurrency wallet addresses and offshore account details he'd uncovered, Victor implemented a sophisticated financial trap. He created what appeared to be another vulnerable, wealthy target, a fictional tech entrepreneur with deteriorating health, substantial assets, and no close family. The digital breadcrumbs led back to actual accounts Victor had established with enough funds to appear legitimate. When Walsh inevitably took the bait, accessing the accounts from his Portuguese hideout, it triggered two events: a complete trace of his location and actual accounts, and an automatic notification to Interpol and the FBI with comprehensive evidence of his crimes across multiple jurisdictions. "We've got him," Noah confirmed during a secure call. Portuguese authorities raided his villa this morning. They found evidence linking him to at least 12 similar schemes across 3 countries. He's being extradited to face charges in the U.S. Victor nodded, satisfied with this development, but not yet finished. And the accounts? As you predicted, he had over 20 million in hidden assets. The forensic accountants are having a field day. They're already identifying victims for restitution. "Good," Victor replied. "And the final piece?" Noah hesitated. "It's ready, but Victor, this crosses a line. The evidence packet you've compiled, the interviews with his previous victims, the psychological profile documenting his predatory methods. Publishing all this isn't just punitive. It's necessary," Victor finished firmly. "Every potential victim should recognize his methods. Every prosecutor should understand his patterns. Every judge should know his history of manipulating the system." The comprehensive dossier on Adrian Walsh was released to law enforcement agencies, victims' advocacy groups, and selected journalists the following day. Within a week, documentaries were being planned, additional victims were coming forward, and Walsh's carefully constructed persona was irreparably shattered. Victor watched the news coverage from his home office, feeling not joy but a cold satisfaction. Phase 2 was nearly complete. Justice, real justice, was being served. Chapter 6, Checkmate. 6 months after the failed competency hearing, Victor sat across from District Attorney Eleanor Martinez, reviewing the case status. "Walsh has accepted a plea deal," Martinez explained. 25 years without possibility of parole. Given his age, that's effectively a life sentence. "And the restitution?" Victor asked. "Over 18 million recovered so far, being distributed to his victims. Your financial forensics were instrumental. We'd never have traced those accounts without your team's work." Victor nodded. "And Diana?" Martinez consulted her notes. 7 years for financial exploitation, conspiracy, and perjury. Her cooperation against Walsh helped, but the recordings you provided left her little room to maneuver. "My parents. 3 years probation, community service, and financial restitution." Their attorneys argued successfully that they were manipulated by Walsh, though the judge made it clear he found their betrayal of their son particularly troubling. Victor absorbed this information silently. The legal system had functioned better than he'd expected, particularly with the overwhelming evidence he'd provided. But there remained loose ends, aspects of justice the courts couldn't address. After leaving the DA's office, Victor drove to a modest apartment complex on the city's outskirts. Diana had been released on bail, pending her appeal, relegated to wearing an ankle monitor and working at a convenience store, the only employment her now-tarnished reputation could secure. He watched from his car as she emerged, looking vastly different from the polished socialite who had shared his home. Her designer clothes had been replaced by discount store attire, her professionally styled hair now dull and self-trimmed. She walked with hunched shoulders, constantly glancing around as if expecting to be recognized or accosted. Victor didn't approach her. Seeing the consequences of her actions manifested so visibly was sufficient. Instead, he placed a call to Noah. "Is everything in place for tomorrow?" "Yes," Noah confirmed. "The Research Foundation announcement is scheduled for 10 a.m. All major scientific publications and pharmaceutical industry outlets will cover it." "And the board members?" "Confirmed. Dr. Eliza Winters is particularly excited to serve as chairperson, given her personal experience as one of Walsh's victims." The following morning, Victor stood at a podium in the university's conference center, addressing a room of journalists, scientists, and industry leaders. The Mercer Foundation for Scientific Integrity will fund research and advocacy at the intersection of scientific advancement and ethical oversight, he announced. Our initial endowment of $50 million, derived from my recent pharmaceutical delivery system patents, will support scientists facing false accusations, fund integrity investigations, and provide legal assistance to researchers whose work is being exploited. He continued, the foundation will also establish a specialized division focusing on financial exploitation of vulnerable individuals in scientific and medical communities. This division, headed by Dr. Eliza Winters, will work directly with law enforcement to identify and stop predatory schemes before they destroy lives and valuable research. The irony wasn't lost on those familiar with Victor's story. He had transformed his personal tragedy into a powerful force for prevention and protection. The very patents Diana and Walsh had conspired to control now funded an organization dedicated to stopping similar predators. As the event concluded, a reporter asked the question Victor had anticipated. Dr. Mercer, given your personal experience with false accusations and exploitation, do you have any message for your former wife or parents? Victor met the reporter's gaze steadily. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration and prevention. My message to anyone who betrays trust for financial gain is simple. Your actions have consequences beyond what you can imagine. And to those who might become victims, trust but verify. Always. Later that evening, as coverage of the foundation launch dominated scientific news channels, Victor received an unexpected email from his father. The subject line read simply, "Please read, Robert." After a moment's hesitation, Victor opened it. Victor, words cannot undo what your mother and I did. We betrayed you in the worst possible way, choosing to believe lies about our own son. The pain and shame we feel is beyond expression. We don't ask for forgiveness. We don't deserve it. But we want you to know that we recognize the full horror of our actions. The foundation you've created from this tragedy shows a strength of character we failed to appreciate. If you ever wish to speak with us, we are here. If not, we understand completely. Dad. Victor read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Perhaps someday he would address his parents again, but that day had not yet arrived. Their consequences, social ostracism, financial loss, and the permanent fracture of their family, would continue, just as his own pain continued. That night, Victor stood on the balcony of his new home, overlooking the ocean. The cool evening breeze carried away the last wisps of anger he'd been harboring. In its place settled something cooler, clearer, a crystalline understanding that justice had been achieved not through courts alone, but through his own calculated actions. Diana, Walsh, and his parents had all received precisely calibrated consequences. The legal system had imposed its penalties, but Victor had ensured that justice extended beyond imprisonment or fines to touch the aspects of life each valued most: reputation, freedom, social standing, and future opportunity. He had not forgiven. He would not forget. But he had prevailed completely, transforming attempt to destroy him into fuel for a mission larger than himself. In the alchemy of his response, he had converted betrayal into purpose. Victor raised his glass to the distant horizon. Checkmate, he whispered to the unhearing ocean. Chapter 7, Phoenix Rising. 1 year after founding the Mercer Foundation, Victor's life had transformed completely. His pharmaceutical delivery system patents had revolutionized cancer treatment protocols globally, bringing both enormous financial success and professional acclaim. The foundation had already assisted 7 scientists facing false accusations and uncovered 2 major research fraud schemes. On a personal level, however, Victor remained isolated. Despite encouragement from Noah and colleagues to move on, he maintained a rigorous focus on work, avoiding social entanglements. The betrayal had left scars not visible but deeply felt. That changed unexpectedly during a foundation fundraiser at the San Diego Natural History Museum. Victor was discussing research ethics with a group of pharmaceutical executives when he was approached by Dr. Lydia Reeves, a forensic accountant and financial crime specialist who had recently joined the Foundation's advisory board. Your Foundation's algorithms for detecting financial exploitation patterns are impressive, she said after introductions. But they're missing behavioral indicators that typically precede financial moves. Victor raised an eyebrow, such as isolating the target from support networks, creating artificial dependency, staged rescues from manufactured problems. Lydia's direct gaze held his. I analyzed the Walsh case files. He was textbook, but your algorithms would only have flagged him after financial movements began. You're suggesting preventative rather than reactive detection. She nodded. Exactly. I've developed behavioral pattern recognition systems for the FBI's Elder Fraud Division. With modifications, they could significantly enhance your Foundation's protective capabilities. Their conversation extended well beyond the fundraiser, continuing over dinner at a nearby restaurant. Victor found himself both professionally intrigued and personally disarmed by Lydia's analytical mind and straightforward manner. You don't shy away from difficult topics, he observed as they discussed Walsh's methodology. Professional hazard, she replied with a slight smile. Forensic accounting teaches you to look unflinchingly at human nature's darker aspects. People reveal themselves through their financial decisions more honestly than through their words. Is that why you agreed to join our advisory board? Fascinating case studies. Lydia considered the question. Partially, but also because your Foundation is addressing something personal to me. My grandfather was targeted by someone like Walsh. Unlike you, we couldn't stop it in time. This revelation created an unexpected connection. Over the following months, Victor and Lydia collaborated closely on enhancing the Foundation's protective systems. Their professional relationship gradually evolved into friendship, built on shared purpose and mutual respect rather than the superficial attraction that had characterized his relationship with Diana. Meanwhile, consequences continued unfolding for those who had betrayed Victor. Diana's appeal had been denied, and she was serving her sentence at a medium-security women's facility. Recent reports indicated she had attempted to manipulate fellow inmates and staff with little success, her practice charm failing in an environment immune to such tactics. Adrian Walsh was faring no better in federal prison. His former victims had filed additional civil suits, ensuring that any assets he might have hidden remained beyond his reach. The comprehensive psychological profile Victor had published had become a case study in criminal justice programs, immortalizing Walsh as a textbook predator. Victor's parents had completed their community service requirements, but the social and financial consequences continued. Robert's former business was thriving under new leadership, having distanced itself completely from its founder. They had sold their home and relocated to a modest apartment in another state, starting over in their 70s with diminished resources and reputations. Victor maintained distant awareness of these developments without actively tracking them. His focus had shifted to building rather than punishing, to protecting potential victims rather than monitoring his victimizers. On the anniversary of the court hearing that had exposed the conspiracy, Noah invited Victor to dinner at his home. To new beginnings, Noah said, raising his glass once they were seated with their meals. The Foundation is thriving, your research is changing lives, and you seem lighter. Victor acknowledged this with a nod. I found purpose in prevention. It's more satisfying than I expected. And Dr. Reeves? Noah asked with studied casualness. Victor gave him a sharp look. Lydia is a colleague and friend, who you've had dinner with 8 times in the past month, Noah pointed out. Just work discussions? Mostly, Victor admitted, but also comfortable. She understands boundaries and has no agenda beyond what's stated. That's rare. Have you told her everything? About what you did beyond the legal system? Victor shook his head. Not explicitly, but she's a forensic investigator who's reviewed all the case files. I suspect she's pieced together most of it. Noah studied his friend. You know, when this all began, I worried about what your pursuit of justice might do to you, how it might harden you. Instead, it's clarified something in you. Facing betrayal forces choices, Victor replied. You become either perpetually suspicious or selectively trusting with better verification systems. I chose the latter. Later that week, Victor invited Lydia to the Foundation's research facility. After showing her their latest detection algorithms, he led her to a secure conference room. "There's something you should know," he said, activating the room's privacy protocols, about how Walsh was really caught. Lydia's expression remained neutral. "You created a honeypot operation using fictional accounts as bait, tracked his access to identify his location, and simultaneously triggered notifications to international authorities." Victor blinked in surprise. "You knew. I told you. People reveal themselves through financial patterns." The Walsh investigation file had gaps only someone with intimate knowledge of his methods and extraordinary resources could have filled. She met his gaze directly. "The question isn't whether you orchestrated his capture, but why you're telling me now." "Because trust requires transparency," Victor answered. "And because I've come to value your perspective." "On the ethics of vigilante justice?" she asked, though without judgment in her tone. "On whether justice achieved through unorthodox means diminishes its validity." Lydia considered this. Justice systems exist because collective, dispassionate judgment is generally more reliable than individual, emotionally driven retribution. But systems fail, sometimes by design, sometimes by exploitation. "You're not answering the question." "Because it's the wrong question," she replied. "The real question is whether your actions were proportionate to the harm and focused on prevention rather than punishment. From what I've observed, you targeted accountability and protection of future victims, not personal vengeance." She leaned forward slightly. "I don't judge you for ensuring Walsh couldn't escape again, Victor. The system had failed his previous victims. But I would be concerned if you couldn't distinguish between justice and revenge moving forward. And if I can make that distinction..." Lydia smiled slightly. "Then I'd be interested in continuing both our professional collaboration and our dinners that are mostly about work." For the first time in years, Victor felt something long dormant stir. Not the infatuation he'd once mistaken for love with Diana, but something steadier, based on mutual understanding and shared purpose. As they left the conference room, his phone buzzed with a notification. The Foundation's monitoring system had identified another potential predator using Walsh's methodologies, targeting vulnerable researchers at a Midwest university. "Duty calls," he told Lydia, showing her the alert. She nodded. "Let's stop this one before anyone gets hurt." Together, they headed toward the monitoring center, their shared commitment to prevention stronger than any desire for retribution. Victor had not forgiven those who betrayed him, nor would he ever welcome them back into his life. But he had transformed their betrayal into something powerful and protective, a legacy that would far outlast the pain they had caused. Chapter 8. The Final Reckoning. 3 years after establishing the Mercer Foundation, Victor found himself facing an unexpected dilemma. His relationship with Lydia had deepened into something substantial, based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine understanding. They had moved in together 6 months earlier, creating a home that felt secure in ways his marriage never had. The foundation had expanded internationally, with offices in 7 countries and a global reputation for both scientific integrity and financial protection. Its algorithms had prevented dozens of exploitation attempts and supported over 100 researchers facing false accusations or intellectual property theft. Yet despite this progress, the past refused to stay buried. On a cool autumn morning, Victor received a call from Noah that would force him to confront the unresolved aspects of his story. "Adrian Walsh is dying," Noah said without preamble. "Terminal pancreatic cancer. The federal prison system has moved him to their medical facility with an estimated 3 months to live." Victor absorbed this news silently. Walsh had served just 4 years of his 25-year sentence. "He's requested to see you," Noah continued, "supposedly to make amends before he dies." "Unlikely," Victor replied. "More probably a final manipulation attempt." "That's my assessment too," Noah agreed. "But there's more. Diana has also reached out through her attorney. She's eligible for parole next month and wants to apologize in person before her hearing." Victor felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. Convenient timing. Very. especially since she's hired a publicity firm specializing in redemption narratives for public figures. After ending the call, Victor stood on his balcony, looking out at the ocean. The Foundation's success should have made these requests irrelevant, mere footnotes in a story that had evolved far beyond personal betrayal. Yet their reemergence stirred something unresolved within him. That evening, he shared the developments with Lydia as they prepared dinner together. "You don't owe either of them closure," she said after listening. "Their desire for absolution isn't your responsibility." "It's not about absolution," Victor replied, carefully slicing vegetables. "It's about ensuring they can't rewrite the narrative for public consumption or parole boards." Lydia studied him. "You're considering seeing them." "On my terms, yes." He met her gaze. Not for forgiveness, but for finality. After thoughtful discussion, they developed a strategy. Victor would meet both Walsh and Diana, but with specific conditions and protections in place. The encounters would serve not as reconciliation opportunities, but as final confirmation that justice had been achieved. The federal medical facility where Walsh was confined resembled a hospital more than a prison, though security remained evident in the guarded entrances and monitored visiting areas. Victor was escorted to a private room where Walsh waited, handcuffed to his bed despite his visibly deteriorated condition. Once vibrant and commanding, Adrian Walsh had withered into a gaunt specter. His expensive suits replaced by standard-issue medical gowns, his once perfect appearance now marked by jaundiced skin and thinning hair. "Dr. Mercer," Walsh greeted him, his voice weaker but still carrying that cultivated charm. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "Curiosity," Victor replied, taking a seat across from the bed. "About what possible amends you think you could make." Walsh attempted a smile that came across as a grimace. "Direct as always. That's what makes you different from most marks. Forgive me, clients. You never fully trusted the performance. Is that why I'm here? For a professional assessment of why your scheme failed?" "No." Walsh shifted painfully. "I'm dying, Victor. Whatever you believe about me, that part isn't manipulation. Before I go, I wanted to acknowledge worthy opposition when I encountered it." Victor's expression remained neutral. "This isn't a chess match, Walsh. You try to have me institutionalized and steal everything I'd worked for. Yes, and you orchestrated my complete destruction in response." Walsh's eyes, though sunken, held a glint of their former calculation. "Don't insult my intelligence by denying it. The honeypot operation was brilliantly executed, far beyond what federal authorities could have managed alone. You seem to be confusing justice with revenge. Are they so different?" Walsh asked. "We're more alike than you'd care to admit, Victor. Both methodical, both willing to circumvent conventional limitations to achieve our goals." Victor leaned forward slightly. "Here's the fundamental difference, Walsh. You destroyed lives for personal gain. I stopped you from destroying more." Walsh studied him for a moment. "Is that how you justify the systematic dismantling of my life beyond legal consequences? The psychological profile publication? The outreach to every previous victim? The forensic accounting that found accounts even I had forgotten?" "I don't need justification," Victor replied evenly. "The world is safer with you exposed and contained. And your ex-wife? Your parents? Were those consequences also about public safety or personal retribution?" Victor didn't answer immediately, considering the question seriously. "Both," he finally acknowledged. "They betrayed fundamental trust. The consequences they faced were proportionate to that betrayal." Walsh nodded slowly. "Honest, at least." He coughed painfully before continuing. "I didn't ask you here for forgiveness, Victor. I wanted to see the man who beat me in my own game. In another life, we might have been partners rather than adversaries. In no version of reality would I partner with someone who preys on vulnerable people," Victor stated. "Perhaps not." Walsh's energy seemed to be fading. "One last thing, though. Diana wasn't initially part of the plan. I recruited her after meeting her through your parents. She was enthusiastic about the opportunity." Victor stood. "I'm aware of everyone's respective roles in the conspiracy, Walsh. Your deathbed revelations aren't revealing anything new." As he turned to leave, Walsh called after him. "Does it feel as satisfying as you hoped?" The revenge. Victor paused at the door. It wasn't about satisfaction. It was about ensuring you could never do this again. He looked back at the dying man. In that regard, it was entirely successful. 2 days later, Victor met Diana at a secure room in her minimum security prison. Unlike Walsh, whose deterioration had been driven by illness, Diana's transformation seemed calculated. She'd adopted a modest appearance, her prison uniform neat, her manner subdued yet earnest. "Victor," she began when he sat across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. Let's be clear about why I'm here," Victor replied. "Not for reconciliation or to support your parole application." Diana nodded, looking down briefly. "I understand. I needed to tell you face to face that I recognize the harm I caused. The therapy program here has helped me understand my patterns of manipulation and entitlement. Convenient realizations before your parole hearing." She flinched slightly. "I deserve that skepticism. But people can change, Victor. I'm not the same person who betrayed you." "Interesting timing for this transformation," Victor observed. "Your publicity firm suggested highlighting redemption for the parole board, I assume?" Diana's practiced composure slipped momentarily. "You know about that. I make it my business to stay informed about people who've tried to destroy me." She regrouped quickly. "The publicity firm was poor judgment on my part. I've terminated that relationship. This isn't about public image. It's about accepting responsibility." Victor studied her carefully. The Diana he'd known would say exactly these things, hit exactly these notes of contrition, if it served her interests. But whether this was genuine remorse or skilled performance hardly mattered. "Your parole hearing is your concern, not mine," he said finally. "I have no intention of appearing or making statements either way." Relief flickered across her face before she controlled it. "I understand. I just want you to know that regardless of the hearing outcome, I plan to make amends through actions. I've been helping other women here understand financial manipulation patterns, using my own story as a warning." Turning exploitation into education, Victor noted. "Efficient." Diana met his gaze directly. "I don't expect forgiveness, Victor. Some betrayals are too profound. But I hope someday you'll believe that people can genuinely change, even people who've hurt you unforgivably." "Perhaps some can," Victor acknowledged. "Time will tell if you're among them." As they concluded their meeting, Diana asked one final question. "Are you happy now, Victor?" Truly. The question seemed sincere, lacking the manipulative undertone he'd expected. "I've built something meaningful from what you and Walsh tried to destroy," he answered. "The foundation protects people from schemes like yours and supports researchers facing the kind of accusations you plan to level against me. So yes, I've found purpose and connection." Diana nodded slowly. "Good. Despite everything, I'm glad for that." Victor left the prison with a sense of completion rather than catharsis. Diana would likely receive parole. She was skilled at presenting the narrative required for each audience. Walsh would die in custody, his legacy forever defined by his predatory schemes rather than his carefully cultivated charm. Later that week, Victor received an unexpected letter postmarked from a small town in Oregon, his parents' current location. Unlike previous attempts at communication, which he disposed of unopened, this envelope contained something that caught his attention: a cashier's check for $175,000 and a single sheet of paper with his father's handwriting. "Victor, this represents everything we have left. It cannot undo our betrayal, but perhaps it can help someone else through your foundation. We don't ask for acknowledgement or forgiveness, just that these funds might prevent another family's destruction. We will not contact you again. Robert and Ellen Mercer." Victor studied the check thoughtfully. The amount likely represented the sale of their remaining assets, a complete financial capitulation. After a moment's consideration, he contacted the foundation's financial director and arranged for the funds to be directed to a new initiative: educational programs helping families recognize and prevent predatory influence. We shared the letter with Lydia that evening. She asked, "Will you acknowledge it? Let them know you received it." Victor considered this. "No, this isn't about reconciliation. It's their final accountability. They've accepted the permanent consequences of their choices." Lydia nodded. "Closure doesn't always require forgiveness or reconnection." "Exactly." Victor placed the letter in a folder containing all documentation related to the conspiracy. This chapter is finished. In his home office later that night, Victor archived the complete file, legal documents, investigation reports, financial records, and now this final letter, sealing it permanently. The Foundation would continue its protective mission, but his personal involvement with those who had betrayed him was definitively concluded. He had not forgiven. He would never forget. But he had ensured justice was served in full measure and transformed betrayal into lasting protection for others. In this, he had found not just vengeance, but something ultimately more satisfying, meaningful resolution on his own terms. Chapter 9, Legacy of Steel. 5 years after the attempted competency hearing that had nearly destroyed him, Victor Mercer stood at the podium of the newly inaugurated Mercer Institute for Scientific Integrity and Financial Protection. The gleaming research and education facility represented the evolution of his foundation into a global force for prevention and protection. Today we launch not just a building, but a commitment. Victor addressed the assembled guests, scientists, financial crimes specialists, law enforcement officials, and supporters. A commitment that exploitation through legal manipulation will be recognized, exposed, and prevented. That brilliant minds will be protected from those who would use their vulnerability for personal gain. The audience included Noah, now the Institute's chief operating officer, and Lydia, who had become both Victor's wife and the Institute's director of financial forensics. Their partnership had deepened into a marriage built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine trust. Everything his relationship with Diana had lacked. As Victor concluded his remarks, he announced the Institute's newest initiative. Today, we're launching the Preventative Recognition Program, training law enforcement and social service agencies to identify vulnerability patterns before exploitation occurs. This program transforms hard-earned lessons into protection for potential victims. What he didn't mention was that this initiative was funded entirely by the final restitution from his parents and additional funds recovered from Walsh's hidden accounts. Poetic justice manifest in practical protection. Following the ceremony, Victor and Lydia hosted a private reception for key supporters and team members. During a quiet moment, Noah approached Victor with a newspaper clipping. "Thought you should see this," Noah said, handing over the article. Published yesterday. The obituary was brief. Adrian Walsh, 67, died Tuesday at Federal Medical Center, Rochester. Private cremation, no services at request of deceased. Victor folded the clipping without comment, sliding it into his pocket. Walsh had outlived doctors' predictions by nearly 2 years, though he had remained confined to the medical facility throughout. Also, Noah continued, Diana's autobiography is being published next month. Redemption Path, From Privilege to Prison to Purpose. Advanced copies have gone to reviewers. Victor raised an eyebrow. Have you read it? Portions. She portrays herself as a misguided woman manipulated by Walsh, who found enlightenment through consequences. She mentions you, but carefully acknowledges her wrongdoing without details that would trigger libel issues. And my parents? Presented as well-intentioned, but easily influenced by Walsh. She's crafted a narrative that accepts nominal responsibility while redistributing the actual blame. Victor nodded thoughtfully. As expected, has the Institute received her donation offer? Noah grimaced slightly. Yes, 10% of proceeds to the foundation, with requested publicity about her commitment to making amends. Declined politely, Victor instructed. The Institute doesn't accept funds from individuals directly involved in exploitation cases we've documented. Already done, Noah assured him, though her publisher called twice to negotiate. Later that evening, as Victor and Lydia walked along the beach near their home, he shared the updates about Walsh and Diana. Are you concerned about her book reshaping the narrative? Lydia asked. Victor shook his head. Her version of events is irrelevant. The court records, evidence, and outcomes speak for themselves. And your parents? Any recent contact? None since the donation letter 3 years ago, Victor replied, which is appropriate. Some betrayals permanently sever relationships, regardless of subsequent regret. Lydia took his hand as they walked. The Institute has become something remarkable, Victor. From personal betrayal to global protection, it's a legacy of immense value. Built on hard lessons, he acknowledged, but serving its purpose. That purpose had expanded beyond his initial vision. The Institute now maintained the world's most comprehensive database of financial exploitation methodologies, trained protection specialists globally, and provided direct intervention for vulnerable individuals. Its scientific integrity division had revolutionized how research disputes were evaluated and resolved, significantly reducing false accusations. 6 months later, Victor received an unexpected call from Brendan Russo, the private investigator who had helped expose the original conspiracy. "Sorry to disturb you, Dr. Mercer, but there's a situation you should be aware of. Diana Mercer was found unconscious in her apartment last night. Apparent suicide attempt following her book's commercial failure and widespread criticism of her redemption narrative." Victor absorbed this information silently before asking. "Her condition? Stable but serious. The hospital reports she left a note specifically mentioning you. Something about finally understanding the true consequences of betrayal couldn't be escaped through reinvention." "I see," Victor replied. "Please keep me informed of developments, but I won't be visiting or making statements." After ending the call, Victor shared the news with Lydia. "Are you all right?" she asked, studying his expression. "Yes," he answered honestly. "Diana's current situation is the natural conclusion of choices made years ago. My responsibility ended when justice was served. Some might consider reaching out an act of compassion," Lydia observed, not suggesting, but exploring his perspective. "Compassion doesn't require re-engagement," Victor explained. "The most respectful response is maintaining the boundaries established by her actions. She's receiving medical care and has a support system through her rehabilitation community. My presence would serve neither her recovery nor my principles." Lydia nodded her understanding. Boundaries are sometimes the truest form of resolution. In the weeks that followed, Victor continued the Institute's work without distraction. News reports indicated Diana had recovered physically and entered intensive psychiatric treatment. His parents remained silent, honoring their commitment to permanent separation. The story had reached its natural conclusion, not through forgiveness or reconciliation, but through consequences fully realized and a future built from their painful lessons. 1 year later, at the Institute's annual conference, Victor unveiled their most ambitious project yet, an international coalition of scientific, financial, legal, and protection agencies dedicated to creating unified responses to exploitation attempts. "The greatest vulnerability exists in isolation," he told the assembled representatives. "By connecting protection systems across disciplines and borders, we eliminate the gaps predators exploit." The coalition represented everything Walsh, Diana, and his parents had never anticipated when they launched their scheme against him. A global network of protection born directly from their attempt to victimize one person. As the conference concluded, Noah found Victor reviewing the coalition's implementation timeline. 7 years ago, when they came after you, could you have imagined this? Noah asked, gesturing around the Institute. Victor considered the question. No. But transforming personal injury into systemic protection gives meaning to an experience that would otherwise be merely painful. Without forgiveness, Noah noted. Without forgiveness, Victor confirmed. Some actions don't merit forgiveness. They merit consequences and containment. What matters is converting those consequences into protection for others. That evening, Victor and Lydia hosted a small dinner for the coalition's founding members at their home. As conversations flowed around scientific ethics and financial protection strategies, Victor realized he had achieved something his would-be destroyers could never comprehend. A legacy built not on vengeance, but on transformation. He had not forgiven those who betrayed him. He had not welcomed them back into his life, even as they faced their own downfall.